Whom do you trust? It's a problem that everybody has. It's a problem that ranges now from your social circle and which advice you take from which person and actually try to implement it into your life, and how important this advice is, how you bias your perception towards implementing this advice or not implementing this advice into your life. And also a question of how do we find out who to trust or whom to trust on the internet, for example. Therefore, the people we haven't met yet. If we just assume these two different categories, I think in the first category, what we often have is other social cues. So even if we are not able at a certain level to judge how trustworthy a person actually is on an individual level, the fact that some of our friends, for example, trust already this person, and we trust our friends, and we trust our friends' ability to find out whether to trust others, is then a good proxy for us whether to trust this person. Therefore, the decision algorithm is then simplified for us. If a friend already approved another friend, then we are probably also more likely to approve this other friend as one of our friends now. Now on the internet, it's different. If I am here telling you about something, you don't know whether you should trust me. So therefore I think we have two things. The first thing is whether and how, not whether, but most importantly how this person carries himself. You could also say this person's behavior. If I speak on the camera and I seem to have not a clue what I'm actually talking about, then of course I'm on a scale from trustworthy to less trustworthy, more on the less trustworthy side. If in the beginning, but instead I also say that I have external verification for my trust, or for just having this external verification for So the first factor is how you behave, basically. And this includes how you speak, this includes in which kind of a voice you speak, this includes how you look, and so on and so forth. So if we all just assume this is behavior, what we can observe basically from this person. You could also say these are only just the visual, not the visual, but the sensory, the informational cues we can get from a person. Of course now, if the relationship now is not a relationship that is actually real, but is much more a parasocial relationship on the internet, that is basically you and another person, then it becomes more difficult because these other social cues we usually have are not there, and also the other cues that we only would have in real life aren't there, because there is just a certain bandwidth of information. There is only 1080p or 4K video of this person. There is only this very short frame, this very short phase which they actually choose to share, which of course completely biases how this person actually portrays themselves, and then biases how we can perceive this person, because this person actually choose to post this, to write this, to publish this paper. So therefore we already have a major intervention in how we are able to judge whether to trust somebody else. And of course in everyday life you can also portray yourself slightly different, but as time goes on and as you spend time with another person, you also begin to see the person interact with a lot of other things in their environment. So therefore, the longer we spend time with a person, the more time we spend with a person, the more we can collect information, data basically, about the behavior of this person, and then ultimately conclude whether to trust this person or not. And of course, this is also just a very dualistic view. It's not actually whether you trust this person or not trust this person, but just how much you trust this person. Back to the beginning, just how much you trust the advice somebody gives you. Now, there's also this other thing, and this other thing is something that, at least in my perception of recent discussions, is something that seems to be less and less valuable. But I actually would argue that it becomes more and more and more valuable. Maybe it also just stays the same and both are influenced by my bias or by my perception of this whole scenario. And this thing is something I already mentioned. And this thing is a standardized external verification of some skill or another. If we say, for example, that some person has a CV, so basically this person tells you what they already did in their life, then we have the problem that we don't really have a standardized verification for whether this is actually true. Now, of course, you can go through the list and contact all these institutions. And there we already land on the thing that provides the trust for us. Institutions. Standardized institutions. And of course, these institutions often also have kind of a whole sphere of associations that come with this institution. If you just say you have been at Stanford, you have been a professor at Stanford, at Harvard, or at any other of the Ivy League universities, or any other universities that is kind of well known and well established as one of the best universities in the world, then of course this has an effect. This has an effect of how we then perceive the behavior. It basically biases our perception of the behavior of this person towards either this person seemingly being more intelligent or seemingly being less intelligent. Just using intelligent as a proxy for how well this person is not really put together, but how well this person is able to portray himself. And as we increase the interactions with people over time as a human society, as we develop as a human society, not a few hundred years back, but a few thousand, maybe multiple thousand years back, trust was something that was usually within a tribe, but not given really but outside of the borders of this tribe. So you maybe had 50, 100, maybe 150 people you actually had to know, and that's kind of it, because there have been maybe geographic differences between this tribe and the other tribe, and so on and so forth. Also, of course, depending on which time period we actually take a look at. But now, increasingly, we have to deal with more and more people, and therefore companies and also institutions and governments have invented solutions for external validation, external verification of some skill or another. Not necessarily of trust, because trust is a thing that only can be given from one person to another. Trust is basically a function of whether you actually believe what this person is telling you, whether you do what this person recommends you, and so on and so forth. I cannot actually really explain what trust is as of now. From Oxford Languages, trust is a firm belief in the reliability, truth, or ability of someone or something. An arrangement, when it comes to law, whereby a person, a trustee, holds property as its nominal owner for the good of one or more beneficiaries. And that's basically it. That's the noun trust. And the verb trust is believe in the reliability, truth, or ability of. So ability, again, is kind of a more general, an umbrella term for skill, you could say. Truth is how accurate something is. But actually, I would say that truth is not really the same as accuracy, because truth is something that is much more emotional, much more often also religious, or at least used in a religious sense, and therefore accuracy is actually the word we are striving for. And reliability is just how likely a person is to do the thing they said or stated, or through behavior stated they actually would do. Or at least it would be reasonable to assume that this person stated the following thing, even though maybe it didn't state, he or she didn't state the following thing, but just made it more or less obvious that we then would think that this is what the person then would do. You could also say it's, instead of reliability, which is still on a personal to personal level, basically on an interpersonal level, you could say it is predictability. And also not really predictability, but how predictable someone is. In conclusion, it's how reliable someone is, how predictable their behavior is, how accurate the things they state are, or through behavior state are, and how able they are, or what skills they have. Of course, skills, again, is not the overarching term we are searching for, if we want to simplify things down to umbrella terms. The problem now with a person telling you that they did something is that you cannot really validate it. Therefore, you have to rely either on other person, but in general, you could say that a person, compared to an institution, is maybe something you shouldn't really trust. Or it takes a lot of, you have to have a lot more information for you to find out. And it also takes then a lot of more brain power in order to find out whether to actually trust this person. But if we then create a system that is bigger than single individuals, maybe institutions that last over decades, maybe centuries, and we try to find systems that basically try to check over time, maybe also, how trustworthy a person is, or at least check their ability, then we could potentially rely on these institutions and wouldn't have to try to find out whether to trust this person or not trust this person. Now, one of the big proxies we have is the cues we get, basically the information we get from how a person behaves and so on. The next cue we could potentially get is their external verification. And the other cue one also usually uses, I guess, which is only a subset or a result of their behavior, you could say, usually, is how financially able they are. So how much money they have, you could also say. Now, the problem with how much money someone has is that there is basically, apart from a tax report, which only accounts for a certain amount of time, which of course can be largely influenced by projects that last over decades, with maybe multiple companies and institutions and NGOs and so on involved. And then also a tax report is only for a given country. So there is basically no big sheet, no big Excel sheet that exactly tells you how much money a person has, or how much total worth a person possesses. And of course, in some countries, worth or possessions are not something that is the same as in Western countries. So we also potentially have to account for this scenario. For example, in China, you cannot really buy properties, at least from what I am understanding, but often you can only rent properties from the government for a certain period of time. Therefore, in order to use how much money a person makes, and therefore indirectly use how much somebody was in the past historically, or is now willing to pay for a service or product of this person, or a product or service this person has directly or indirectly created, money is not a very reliable proxy. Why? Because we just don't have a reliable source that validates what a person says about their financial wealth. If somebody like Alex Hormozi on the internet says that he has $100 million in net worth, of course this could be true, but he also could be a conman. Not that I suspect that he is, but we just have we cannot really find out. Of course, we can use other proxies such as how many supercars somebody has, or how well put together somebody is, or how intelligent they seem to be, and then using how intelligent or our perception of intelligence of this person as a proxy for how likely it is that they are wealthy. But we actually don't really know. There is no, I would argue, no common thing that we generate that is also very simple to perceive or to get the information thereof that tells us how likely a person is to be wealthy. And that's about it in terms of wealth. Of course, now, if a person seems to now have a lot of other cues, like appearing in talk shows, for example, talking about the money, talking about the stock market, talking about how much money they have, talking about how you can get money, and so on and so forth, then maybe this is a cue. But again, what also could be is that a person, for example, invented something like Uber, not that Uber is a specific specific example of this. But let's say a person invented something like Uber and was actually just very good on the behavior side. Therefore also had, compared to others, major benefits when it comes to convincing others to trust him. So basically, he is more likely to convince others to also give him money, him or her money. So now, over time, as the person then creates this company and maybe doesn't even pay himself out a certain portion of this, maybe doesn't even take a salary, and then exits after 10 years, the question of course is how wealthy they now are. And what could just very well be the case is that they never took salary, that the company maybe collapses at any point in time. And since our evaluation of stocks, for example, is largely based on how we as a society, or as the people who buy the stocks continuously, value each individual stock they buy or sell, this leaves the net worth of a person also up for at least some speculation, or not, of course also to some external variables someone cannot control. If Tesla, SpaceX, of course SpaceX is privately held, but Tesla is not, for example, decrease in value close to zero and approximate actually zero in value, then Elon Musk very, very soon is not the richest person on earth anymore. So the question of how to validate how financially able someone is a question that is very complicated, at least, if not complex, to answer. Of course, ideally now, there would be a register for, not ideally in terms of other things, but ideally in terms of whether to judge what a person actually says about their finances is actually true. For this specific purpose, it would be ideal if there was a registry with all the people on this earth, which of course also isn't really, because there are only registries for specific countries. And even these registries for specific countries usually are not very correct. They maybe have an accuracy of maybe 95%, maybe it's 90%, I don't know. But what matters now is that there is not such a registry. There is not an Excel sheet with all the people on this earth and their actual net worth. And of course, then we would also have to calculate the net worth continuously, and as of course constantly would change, and how we perceive, for example, Tesla. If a person decides to buy all the stocks of Tesla for double the amount the stock is actually worth now, then the amount Tesla is worth actually doubles. But of course also given the fact that this person actually could buy. So now this leaves us with the last thing we now discuss, which are institutions. And these institutions are often either companies or actual educational institutions. So now when it comes to the companies, again, there is some kind of bias from many sides, I guess. So there is not only a psychological distortion, but also a distortion because of varying interests from different parties. If I, for example, want to state or want to make myself appear as if I was more than I actually am in order to maybe get a job at a company where I actually, with my current skill set, would not be able to get the job, then I would maybe slightly exaggerate. And now, of course, it also then depends on whether this company, for example, checks what my CV actually states. If I actually went to this school, to this university, and worked for this company, and what exactly my roles in this company are, and that each of these single steps there is room for slight exaggeration, or also slight under-exaggeration, you could say, the opposite of exaggeration. Now, leaving out the companies, there is one thing that is left, and this one thing is educational institutions that aim for standardized testing, such as the GPA, I think it is called in the US, such as the different kind of degrees you can get. A degree, whether this is an elementary school degree, a high school diploma, or maybe also then a college or a university diploma, maybe it's a bachelor's, maybe it's a master's, or maybe it's actually a PhD. These three, the last three I just mentioned, are basically the most universal verification, external verification we have as a society. That is, mostly standardized, not mostly standardized, but at least to some degree standardized all over the world. So all over the world it is comparably harder to go to university compared to elementary school. Of course, not really actually, because people who can actually just, normal people just cannot go back to elementary school. Maybe normal people can go back to high school, but since these schools also are usually only visitable in a certain age range, this doesn't necessarily mean that it is harder or easier. Or I think the general statement that it is harder or easier to, for example, get an elementary school diploma is not something that actually holds true. Because maybe somebody in elementary school is basically on the lower side of development. So at a certain age, for example, and of course also there is the fact that we have to account for that not every single person on this earth is born on the exact same day. So therefore, varying on which day a person is born, that different people start out basically in different points in time in their learning journeys. So basically it's a constant catching up with other people, and therefore school is only trying to average out a person that within a given year, or maybe also within 2 years, or within a certain time frame at least, was kind of at a certain age and therefore might just be eligible for elementary school. But of course also then there is the fact that pre-positioned by our genes, some people just might be on the lower side of development for their age in elementary school, but then on the higher side of intellectual capability when they are 18 or 35, or maybe they actually peak when they are 60. Of course, there will be genetic variations, but not only genetic variations, but also other variations, such as environmental variations, such as whether a child, for example, is exposed to something hyper-realistic like social media in the early stages of his or her life, or was born 25 years earlier and therefore doesn't have the same overstimulation and therefore seeks more out in the actual world. And now, given the fact that we have bachelors and masters and doctors basically almost everywhere around the earth in all of the major universital institutions, this gives us a proxy of how much a person is able to do the same thing over time to learn a given fixed curriculum, even though the curriculum of course slightly deviates, sometimes not even slightly, but majorly deviates in different countries and in different regions and so on and so forth. But at least that's the best we currently have. And now if you want to prove that you are able to do something for an extended period of time, that you are able to solve problems that appear in a given fixed environment, which might be the university, even though of course it is not really fixed, there are a lot of other variables we theoretically have to account for. Is it easier for somebody who has financial support from their parents throughout their university years compared to somebody who grew up maybe with a single mother or a single father, and maybe the parents died at an early age and they grew up in a foster home, or they didn't even have access to university because they just happened to be born in a country where there is no good educational system, or at least not comparably as good as in other countries. Of course, there are a lot of other variables, but we cannot constrain the environment any further. We could potentially, if we wanted to actually standardize education around the globe by introducing universities that are basically for everybody, that everybody can do on their own schedule, maybe a digital university that then act as actual verification, because the more, maybe that's just a theory, but maybe the more we are able to digitalize the educational system, the more we are able to standardize the educational system, and the more we allow for the different variables that are, for example, whether a person has to care for their mother when they actually still are in universities, or for the 10 children that are left because their parents actually died, and the sister or brother that is then in university actually has to step up as in the role as father, as mother for his siblings. Of course, there are a lot of different variables we have to consider. Also, just how likely is it that you are born in a country where there is actually free speech and you can try, at least to some degree, to say what you actually want to say? and whether the educational system is biased, for example, towards a government that is, of course, all governments are interested in trying to control people, but I would argue that there are some governments that try to control people more. And so therefore also the educational system is kind of a representation or a proxy, not really a proxy, but just a representation, basically a subset of the incentives or the incentive structure a government creates and ultimately uses in order to incentivize its citizens towards reaching at least the governmental goals, the political goals it wants to achieve. So now, if we wanted to create basically a universal thing that is then a universal standard for how able a person is to solve problems in a as constrained environment as possible over time, then of course we also don't really account for the differences in ability. There is just a difference, seemingly. Okay, I take this statement back. The seemingly is, this is the formulation or the phrasing that makes more sense. The seemingly is a difference in intellectual capability. There seemingly often is a difference in how well people are able to actually put into words what they actually think. There seemingly is a difference in how well people are able to do certain jobs and other jobs maybe not. And if we not account for this difference, then of course we cannot really create a standard. Of course we can still create a standard, but then this leaves us with the question of how to solve the differences we encounter. If a person... Now, of course, maybe we don't want to assume that IQ and intelligence are the same. Of course they are not. The IQ is a measurement that of course can be off. But if we just assume that IQ is a measurement that is kind of predictable, then if a person is deviating from the average IQ and deviating in the direction of having a lower IQ to maybe 25%, and you compare this person now in a very standardized environment to a person that is just higher in intellectual capability measured by IQ with 125%, and since IQ is standardized to 100, we can just assume that these numbers now are an IQ of 75 and 125. Then if you compare these two persons and both have to do a degree in neuroscience, the bachelor in neuroscience, the universal now bachelor in neuroscience for all people on this earth, then of course the question arises whether this is actually still fair, or whether it now either should be 25%, so regressing basically to the mean of the average of an IQ of 100, or regressing to the mean, not the mean, but adjusting basically completely for the difference in IQ, and therefore making it maybe 25% harder compared to the average for the person that has an IQ of 125, or at least historically had measurements or average measurements of an IQ of 125 compared to the person who averaged an IQ of 75. Should we then make it easier? But then of course if we make it easier for a person who has an IQ of, as again stated, historically on average and so on, of 75, then do you actually want to have a doctor, for example, who has been adjusted by their intelligence? So what this would mean, for example, if you have a given environment such as an operation table, and then you have two different kind of doctors. The one doctor is the one who had a 25% harder test or external verification, and the other one had a 25% lighter test. Then what this would result in is not a standardized ability of a doctor's ability to then operate. So this means it is more or less luck whether you then are in front of a doctor that is actually more capable, at least if we assume all of the following things, and we also assume that the ability and intellectual ability kind of correlate or are linked to each other and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to say is that there will be a difference. And now, is it fair that some person now gets the doctor that is more able, and the other person gets the doctor that is less able, and then this decreases or increases their chances of mortality? Is this then fair? So therefore, again, back to the universal standards, maybe we shouldn't adjust for something like intellectual ability and have it standardized such as the current system already is. There is just a difference in the average IQ or the measured IQ of people in different fields. For example, lawyers usually have an IQ of upwards from or just maybe ranging from 120 to 130 to 140. Whereas people in other fields just might have a different IQ. The same is true for people who advance the state of human knowledge, basically spearheading it. They usually tend to have a higher IQ. Why? Not necessarily because someone said, okay, it is nice that you have a higher IQ and now you can do research in our facility, but maybe just because a higher IQ is actually just useful. It is a useful tool and therefore makes it easier for this person, therefore makes it more likely for this person to then achieve or receive a PhD, for example. So external validation or verification, not validification, I think just will, as we have to interact with more and more people, or seemingly have to interact, seemingly there is a trend that it goes upwards on how many people we actually interact with. Of course, there are also now studies, at least within the last 2 or 3 years, that say more and more people have less good friends, or maybe not even one good friend, and so on and so forth. But if we just assume that we have to interact with more and more people, or if we then, on the other side, establish technology that allows us to interact with more and more people, such as the Uber driver you actually don't know at all, who could turn out to be a serial killer. But of course, he probably is not a serial killer because we have a system that sorts out for serial killers and that sorts out for people who just are in for, I don't know, the wrong reasons. And therefore only people who actually but use the incentives or are incentivized by these incentives the company gives, such as ratings, for example, which are of course not really controlled by the people themselves, by the people themselves, but much more by the company. In total, as we have the ability to now communicate, even if only unidirectional, with more and more people, I think the more important it becomes that, for example, a channel on YouTube about space or about neuroscience is not just by some random guy on the internet, but maybe actually, instead of some random guy on the internet, by a professor with a PhD of Harvard or Stanford, and specifically Stanford, maybe, then has a professor that then makes content about neuroscience, and you are then maybe more likely to trust this person. Why? Not because you know this person, not because you could observe the behavior of this person over an extended period of time in an actual natural environment, not because this person told you that they have this and this and this, but maybe because there is an external institution that is Stanford that tells you that people like Andrew Huberman, for example, are actually neuroscientists with a PhD, who are also professors, therefore also doctors, and of course not medical doctors in this sense, but in terms of academic ability or academic degree, the doctoral degree, and that this then makes you trust this person more. Not the behavior you can observe, not what the person actually tells you, but the fact that you can maybe call Stanford, theoretically at least, even though obviously almost nobody does. And at least a journalist could go to Stanford and actually check whether this person then actually works at Stanford. And of course what you also could do is just visit the website, for example, and use the website of Andrew Huberman, and maybe also more and more systems that actually have people like Andrew Huberman listed. And there are also, of course, lists like Google Scholar of all the papers that have been published. And the more information that is available that validates what this person says, and therefore increases basically the perceived accuracy of what this person states and what this person actually has done historically, the more you are then maybe likely to trust this person, despite you not even knowing this person.